My family has been living in this part of the country for a very long time, longer than most people can imagine. We've been rooted in the hills of eastern Tennessee since the early 1800s. Back when the roads were dirt, the towns were barely towns, and the land pretty much decided whether you survived or not. Generation after generation stayed put. Same hills, same valleys, same thick woods that seem to swallow sun once the sun goes down. We never had much money, but we had pride. That mattered to the older folks more than anything else. They were proud of where they came from and proud of the work they did, even when that work nearly broke them. Things changed over the years, of course. By the time I came along, people weren't all doing the same jobs anymore. My mom worked nights at a nursing home. My cousin Jeremy went into computer repair. I ended up bouncing between warehouse jobs and delivery driving. But my great-uncle Earl, the man this story is about, came from a different time entirely. Uncle Earl worked the mines, and in my family, his name is still spoken a little quieter than the others. Earl started working underground in 1948. He was 16 years old, skinny as a fence post, with a nervous smile and hands that hadn't done much more than farm chores. Back then, nobody thought twice about sending a kid into a mine. If you could walk and follow orders, you were old enough. He used to say that the first thing he noticed wasn't the darkness. It was the smell, damp rock, old wood, oil from the lamps, and something else he couldn't quite name, something stale and sour that sat in the back of your throat. The men he worked with were all older. Some of them had gray in their beards. Others had coughs that never seemed to stop. They talked loud, laughed rough, and didn't pay much attention to the new kid at first. Except for one man. Everyone called him Doyle. Nobody ever used his first name, and nobody ever joked about him. Doyle was huge. Not just tall, but wide, like he'd been carved out of solid stone. His shoulders barely fit between the support beams in some tunnels. His voice echoed even when he spoke softly, which wasn't often. Doyle had a reputation. He took what he wanted. Money, food, tools. If you protested, he'd smile at you in a way that made your stomach turn cold. If you pushed it further, you'd end up bruised or bleeding somewhere no one could see. The bosses kept him around because he worked like a machine. When Doyle was on shift, the carts filled faster. The numbers looked better. That's all management cared about. For reasons no one could ever explain, Doyle zeroed in on Earl almost immediately. At first it was small things, standing too close, blocking his path in the tunnels, saying his name slowly, like he was tasting it. Other miners noticed and quietly warned Earl to stay near groups, to never be alone, especially at the end of a shift. They didn't explain why. They didn't have to. The looks on their faces said enough. For months, Earl managed to avoid being alone with him. He worked fast, kept his head down, and followed every rule. But mines are tight places. Eventually, paths cross. It happened late one afternoon. The year was 1950 by then, and Earl had just turned 18. The shift was ending, and everyone was tired. Lamps flickered as batteries ran low. The air felt heavier than usual, thick and pressing against the skin. Doyle walked up to the shift supervisor and leaned in close. Whatever he whispered made the man stiffen. His face drained of color, and he nodded quickly. Then the supervisor turned and called Earl over. He told him there was a missing toolbox in one of the lower tunnels. Said it needed to be retrieved immediately. No one else volunteered. No one made eye contact. Earl knew something was wrong. The mine had plenty of tools. There was no rush. But when you're a kid trying to keep your job, you don't argue. You grab your lamp and head back down. The tunnel was quiet. Too quiet. No voices. No carts. Just the sound of his boots scraping stone and the soft drip of water somewhere far away. He searched the area the supervisor mentioned and found nothing. No toolbox, no sign anyone had been there recently. When he turned to head back, His lamp flickered hard, nearly going out. That's when he heard breathing. Slow, heavy, close. Doyle stepped out from behind a support beam, blocking the tunnel completely. His lamp was off, but his face was close enough that Earl could see his grin in the dim light. Doyle told him not to move, not to yell. Said accidents happened in mines all the time. Said nobody would hear a thing. Earl said later that his legs felt numb, like they weren't really attached to his body anymore. He could smell Doyle now. Sweat and metal, and something rotten underneath it. Doyle told him to close his eyes, so he did. He stood there shaking, every muscle locked tight, waiting for pain, waiting for something horrible to happen. His thoughts raced. He counted his breaths. 1, 2, 3. Nothing happened. Seconds passed, then more. The air felt colder. The dripping water stopped. When Earl finally opened his eyes, the tunnel was empty. Doyle was gone. At first, Earl thought it was some kind of sick joke. His heart was still pounding as he made his way back toward the main shaft. Anger slowly replaced fear. He felt embarrassed, like he'd let himself be scared for nothing. When he reached the surface, the first thing someone asked was, "Did you see Doyle?" Earl said he figured Doyle had already come up. That's when the room went quiet. No one had seen Doyle leave the mine. Several men had seen him follow Earl down, but no one saw him come back up. At first, they laughed. Sayed Doyle was probably messing with everyone. But as time passed, the jokes stopped. A search crew went back down. They checked every tunnel, every side passage, every collapsed area they could safely reach. Nothing. No blood. No broken rocks. No footprints. It was like Doyle had stepped into the dark and been erased. The sheriff showed up that night. Asked Earl the same questions over and over. Did you hear a scream? A fall? A fight? Earl told the same story every time. One moment Doyle was there. The next, he wasn't. For weeks, Earl barely slept. He was sure he'd be blamed somehow. But no one could make anything stick. There was no evidence. No body, no crime scene. Then the whispers started. Older miners pulled Earl aside and asked what he'd done. When he swore he hadn't touched Doyle, they exchanged looks. Some nodded like that explained everything. They talked about the tappers, old mine folklore. Little things that lived deep in the rock. Most people laughed it off as superstition. Stories made up to explain missing tools or strange noises. But the old-timers believed. They said the tappers knocked on the walls to warn miners of danger, that they helped lost men find their way out. And sometimes, they said, they took people who didn't belong. Bullies. Thieves. Men who hurt others underground. After Doyle disappeared, everyone treated Earl differently. Kinder. Warmer. Nobody messed with him again. Nobody gave him the worst jobs. And nobody ever sent him down alone. Doyle was never found. Years later, when Earl told the story, his voice would drop when he talked about that tunnel. He always said the same thing. I don't know what took him, but something did. He never went back into a mine after he turned 30. Told everyone in the family to stay far away from that kind of work. Because whatever lives down there, in the dark where sound doesn't travel, right? And shadows don't behave the way they should. It's still there, listening, waiting. At the bottom of a long folded stretch of hills sat a village called Grey Haven Hollow. It wasn't big. It never tried to be. Just a tight cluster of houses, narrow roads, and one old school that everyone knew by heart. The hills rose steeply behind it, dark and heavy, like they were leaning in to listen. Above the village sat Black Ridge Mine. The mine opened in 1911, back when Grey Haven Hollow was barely more than a few stone homes, and a pub that smelled like smoke and wet wool. Over the years, families moved in for work. Brothers, cousins, husbands, wives. Everyone was connected somehow. If you didn't share blood, you shared history or secrets. And the mine left things behind. Every day, wagons hauled waste up the hill. Broken rock, crushed stone, fine black dust that stuck to your skin and didn't wash off easy. The workers called it the leftovers, but most people just called it the piles. They grew slowly at first, little hills of dark earth. Then they kept growing. By the time this story really begins, there were 8 massive piles stacked above Grey Haven Hollow. Some were so tall they blocked the sun in the mornings. One of them, the biggest, sat directly above the village school. That one was called Heap 9. Heap 9 was different. The men who worked near it said it felt wrong under their boots. Too soft, too quiet. It wasn't made of solid rock like the others. It was full of fine dust, ash, and soaked coal grains that shifted when you stepped on them. When it rained, the ground trembled. And it rained a lot. Grey Haven Hollow got rain the way other places got sunshine. It seeped into walls. It pooled in basements. It ran black down the streets after storms. Folks complained that their yards smelled oily after floods, like burned metal and rot mixed together. People noticed. They warned the town council. They warned the mine managers. Parents talked about it at dinner tables, voices low so the kids wouldn't hear. Something's wrong up there, they said. The mine bosses nodded, promised inspections, promised reports, promised plans. Nothing changed. They said fixing the piles would cost too much. They said slowing the mine would hurt everyone. They said Grey Haven Hollow needed the jobs more than it needed peace of mind. So Heap 9 stayed where it was, watching. By the fall of 1974, the rain wouldn't stop. It came down hard for days, soaking the hills until the ground couldn't swallow any more. Water slid through the piles, turning the black dust underneath into something thick and slippery. On the morning of October 14th, workers near Heap 9 noticed something strange. The surface had cracked open in long, crooked lines, like the ground itself was stretching. Rails used to haul waste uphill bent and sagged. One worker, Tom Calder, ran to tell his supervisor. Tom wasn't just a miner. His sister taught at the school below. His nephew sat in the front row every morning. The supervisor told him to stop worrying. Work was canceled for the day. They said they'd deal with it later. Tom went home sick with fear. At 9:18 a.m., the hill gave up. People said they heard it before they saw it. A deep groan, like the earth clearing its throat. Then a roar so loud it rattled windows and split the air. Heap 9 collapsed, not as a fall, as a wave. A wall of black sludge surged down the hillside, moving faster than a running man. It swallowed trees whole. Fences snapped like twigs. The ground shook as if something massive was waking up underneath the village. One woman said it looked alive, like the hill had melted. The first houses were crushed flat in seconds. The sound was wet and heavy, nothing like stone. Pipes burst underground, spraying water straight into the moving mass, making it thicker, faster, angrier. Then it hit Willow Lane School. Inside, the children had just hung up their coats. Some were laughing. Some were complaining about the rain. A teacher, Mrs. Ellen Ward, was writing the date on the board. The windows exploded inward. Black mud poured through the rooms like it had been invited. Desks flipped. Walls cracked. The air vanished. Darkness filled every corner. It was over in moments. By the time the noise stopped, the school was gone. Silence followed. A deep, wrong silence. No birds. No shouting. Just rain tapping against thick black earth where a building used to be. Parents ran. Neighbors ran. They clawed at the sludge with bare hands, screaming names, pulling until their fingers bled. The ground sucked at their boots. The mud was already cooling, hardening, trapping whatever it touched. Fire crews arrived. Police. Miners. They forced people back, afraid the rest of the hill might come down. When digging began again, They found small miracles buried in horror. A cafeteria worker, Mara Hughes, had wrapped herself around 3 children. All 3 lived. She didn't. A teacher had tried to hold a door shut against the flood. It didn't help. By late morning, no more survivors were found. In total, 142 people died that day. 108 of them were children. Greyhaven Hollow never sounded the same again. Volunteers came from everywhere. Doctors, gravediggers, people who just wanted to help carry something. The chapel became a place of whispers and sobbing. Coffins lined the walls, too many, too small. Funerals blurred together. Anger followed grief like a shadow. Parents shouted names of men who never stood trial. Mine officials offered money. Some families refused to touch it. Others took it and cried anyway. The worst part came later. Children who survived couldn't sleep. They dreamed of black waves coming through their bedroom doors. Grown adults woke screaming at the sound of rain. People avoided the hill, but some swore they could hear it at night. Shifting, settling, breathing. Years passed. The mine closed. But Heap 9 was never fully removed. Even now, if you walk the edge of Greyhaven Hollow and the rain is heavy, you might feel the ground tremble just a little. You might hear a low, distant rumble that doesn't belong to thunder. And if you listen closely, some say you can hear children laughing beneath the earth, or calling for someone who never came fast enough. This happened back in 2011, when I was 16, and I was living with my older cousin Mark on his rundown cattle property out near a place locals called Red Hollow. It wasn't an official town, just a stretch of land nobody wanted anymore. The closest real town, Brindle Creek, was almost 12 miles away, and you couldn't even see another house from ours unless you drove for a good while. Mark wasn't really my guardian, not officially anyway. My mom was overseas for work, and my dad had passed a few years earlier, so Mark agreed to let me stay with him for a while. He worked odd construction jobs and spent most nights gone or passed out early, which meant I was alone a lot. That land had a bad feel to it. Everyone who grew up around there knew it. Livestock would disappear without a trace. Sometimes they'd come back days later, torn up in ways that didn't make sense. Not like coyotes or wolves. Worse, the sheriff always said it was predators and told folks to stop exaggerating. But people still whispered. Said there were things in the woods that didn't belong to any book or nature show. Mark brushed it all off. He always said, "Animals are animals. You're just letting the dark mess with your head." I tried to believe him. Most nights, when I couldn't sleep, I'd take short walks around the property. Nothing crazy. Just enough to clear my head. I never went past the glow of the floodlight near the barn. It felt safe there, like the light itself was a fence. Then one night, I went farther. It was early January, freezing cold, with a full moon hanging low in the sky. Fresh snow covered everything, smooth and untouched. The moonlight reflected off it so brightly that it felt like the world was glowing. You could see forever. Trees, fields, fence posts, all sharp and clear. I remember thinking how quiet it was. Too quiet. No wind, no insects. Just stillness. I grabbed my jacket and stepped outside without telling Mark. He was already asleep. Our dogs, 3 big mutts that usually followed me everywhere, were nowhere around. That should have stopped me, but it didn't. I told myself they were probably chasing mice near the old silos. I followed the path past the dead cornfield, crunching softly through the snow, and headed downhill toward the lower pasture. At the bottom was a narrow ravine with a creek cutting through it, winding deep into a thick forest of tall, twisted trees. The locals called it Crow's Cut. I'd been down there before during the day. It was pretty then. Peaceful, even. At night, it felt like something else entirely. I had one earbud in, listening to music low, mostly to break the silence. I felt stupidly confident. I was tall, strong for my age, and convinced that nothing out there would mess with me. That confidence lasted right up until I climbed down into the creek bed. The walls of the ravine were steep, packed with frozen dirt and roots. The creek wasn't fully frozen. Dark water slid slowly beneath thin sheets of ice, making soft, cracking sounds. Those sounds echoed. Every step echoed. Every breath sounded louder than it should have. I walked until I realized I couldn't see an easy way back up. That's when I stopped. I turned my music off and just stood there, staring at the moon through bare branches. It was beautiful in a lonely way, so bright it almost hurt your eyes. And then my stomach dropped, not like fear from a loud noise or sudden movement. This was different, deep, heavy, like my body knew something my brain hadn't caught up to yet. The kind of feeling that makes you want to leave immediately without knowing why. I told myself to relax. I stood there longer than I should have, listening to the water, letting the cold sink into my boots. That was my second mistake. Something moved on the far side of the creek. At first, it was subtle. A slow shift of brush, snow sliding off branches. If there had been any other sound, I might have missed it. But the ravine carried noise in a strange way. Everything felt close, even things that weren't. I stared hard, trying to spot a deer or maybe one of the dogs. The movement kept coming, slow, careful. Then I heard footsteps, not quick, not heavy, measured. Each step cracked ice and pressed snow down with deliberate pressure. My chest tightened. I couldn't move. I couldn't even breathe, right? The thing came into view. It looked like a dog at first, a huge one. Jet black with long limbs and a thick body. Way too big to be normal. It crept out of the brush on all fours and stepped into the moonlight like it knew exactly where it wanted to stand. It lowered its head and drank from the creek. I remember thinking how wrong it looked. Its back was too high. Its legs bent strangely. And the way it drank felt calm, like it wasn't worried at all. The air felt colder. My hands started shaking. I shifted my weight without thinking, and the metal snaps on my jacket clicked together. The sound exploded through the ravine. The creature froze. Then it lifted its head. Its eyes were bright green, not glowing like in movies, but sharp, alert, intelligent. We stared at each other. It growled, low, deep. The sound vibrated in my chest. I backed up slowly, trying not to slip on the ice. The thing bared its teeth and took a step closer. Then it stood up. Not fully upright, just enough. Its front legs lifted, bending at joints that shouldn't bend that way. What I'd thought were paws looked more like hands. Long fingers, dark claws. I wanted to scream. I didn't. I kept backing away, inch by inch, my heart pounding so hard it hurt. The creature followed along the creek bank, staying just close enough. Watching, waiting. I finally reached the slope leading out of the ravine. I backed up the hill, never turning around. When I reached the top, I looked down. It was crossing the creek. That's when I ran. I tore across the pasture, snow flying everywhere. My lungs burned, my legs screamed. I didn't look back until I reached the gate. It was there, standing in the moonlight, watching me. Then I heard barking, loud, furious. All 3 dogs came charging down the hill, teeth bared, fur raised. The creature turned away and vanished into the trees like smoke. I didn't wait to see more. I ran home, locked every door, and grabbed the old shotgun from the closet. I sat on the kitchen floor until morning, shaking. When the sun finally came up, the dogs were back, muddy, tired, silent. I never walked near Crow's Cut again. I moved out a year later. But sometimes, when the night is quiet and the moon is bright, I swear I can still hear footsteps in the snow, moving slow and careful, like something that knows exactly where I am. Let me ask you something first. Have you ever been somewhere so dark and cramped that you suddenly became very aware of your own breathing? Like the air itself felt old, used up, as if it had been trapped there long before you arrived. That's where this story begins. Close your eyes for a second and picture this. You're crouched inside a narrow underground tunnel. You can't stand up straight. You can barely stretch your legs. Your back is pressed against cold, rough stone, and your knees ache from being bent for too long. The ceiling is so low you keep bumping your helmet against it without meaning to. The air is thick and warm, almost sticky. Every breath tastes like dust and rust. Your throat feels dry, and your eyes burn from grit floating around that never seems to settle. Somewhere nearby, metal tools strike stone over and over again. Clang, scrape, thud. The sound echoes through the tunnels and comes back wrong, twisted, like the mine is whispering back at you. This is your job. You've done it every day for weeks now. Or at least you thought you understood it. Then the ground shivers. It's not violent at first. Just a small tremble, like the tunnel is stretching its bones. The tools stop. The voices stop. Everything goes quiet so fast it makes your ears ring. No talking, no footsteps, no metal on stone. Just silence. And then you hear it. At first, it sounds like someone sighing far away. A long, slow breath. You almost convince yourself it's nothing. Maybe your imagination. Maybe the air system kicking on. But the sound doesn't stop. It grows. The breath turns into a deep rushing noise, low and heavy. It swells until it fills the tunnel, pressing against your chest. The walls start to vibrate. Dust rains down from above, sticking to your sweaty skin. The sound gets louder and louder until it's unbearable. Like standing next to a jet engine that's starting up underground. And suddenly you understand. It's water, not a trickle, not a leak. A wall of water racing toward you in total darkness. This is the moment where your body moves before your brain can catch up. You scramble, slipping on wet stone, hands shaking, heart pounding so hard it hurts. You try to run, but the tunnel fights you every step of the way. And deep down, you know, you're not fast enough. Now here's the part that makes this worse. This isn't just a scary story. Something like this really happened, but not where you might expect, and not to the people you think. In the early morning hours of March 3rd, 2006, a small mining operation called Black Hollow Mine sat quietly beneath the hills near a town called Red Willow Ridge. It wasn't a big place. Just a tight-knit operation run by people who all knew each other. Most of the workers were related in one way or another. Brothers, cousins, lifelong friends. Folks who'd grown up together, gone to school together, and trusted each other with their lives. One of them was a man named Aaron Pike. Aaron had only been working at Black Hollow for 4 days. He wasn't supposed to be underground yet, not really. He was still learning the layout, still figuring out how to read the old maps taped to the walls. But they were short-handed that week, so he was sent down with a small crew. Among them was his older cousin, Luke Marino. Luke had been mining since he was barely out of high school. He knew every bend and crack in those tunnels. If something felt off, Luke was usually the first to notice. That morning, nothing seemed wrong, until it was. Aaron remembered it later in pieces, the way the air suddenly felt colder, the way the lights flickered for half a second, the way his stomach dropped for no clear reason. Then came the sound, a deep whoosh like a massive door opening somewhere far away. A blast of wind tore through the tunnel, hard enough to push Aaron back a step. His helmet light shook wildly, casting jumping shadows along the walls. The ground began to tremble, stronger this time, and then Luke appeared. He was running toward Aaron, hunched low, his face pale beneath the grime. His eyes were wide, whites showing all around. "Run?" Luke screamed. Just that, nothing else. Aaron didn't argue. He turned and ran. The tunnel felt longer than it ever had before. His boots slipped on damp rock. His lungs burned. Behind him, Luke's footsteps grew uneven. Luke was older, slower. The air down there wasn't helping. Every breath sounded like it hurt. Aaron slowed, grabbed Luke's arm, tried to pull him along. Luke shook his head, gasping, barely able to stand. "I can't," Luke wheezed. That's when Aaron heard it again. The water. It wasn't just a sound now. He could feel it. A pressure building behind them. The roar filled the tunnel, shaking loose stones from the ceiling. Aaron turned just long enough to see it. A black, churning wall rushing toward them, swallowing the light. Fear like that doesn't feel traumatic. It feels cold, heavy, certain. Aaron was sure they were about to die. Then, impossibly, the water slowed. It surged forward, stopped just inches from Luke's boots, and settled. Muddy water lapped at the stone, swirling angrily, but not rising. Luke collapsed onto a small ledge without realizing it. If he'd fallen a foot lower, he would have been pulled under. They stayed there, shaking, listening to the water grow quiet again. They were alive, somehow. Not everyone was that lucky. Elsewhere in the mine were 4 others. Brothers, a father and son. Men who had worked those tunnels for decades. When the flood hit, it tore through side passages in seconds. Lights went out. Tunnels filled. There was no warning, no time to run. By the time Aaron and Luke made it back to the surface, covered in mud and barely able to speak, the truth had already settled in. The others weren't coming back. Rescue teams arrived quickly, but the mine was old, unstable, dangerous. Water filled the passages, carrying debris and silt so thick divers couldn't see their own hands. Families waited above ground, wrapped in blankets, staring at the mine entrance like it might give something back. Hours passed, then a day, then another. Eventually, the families asked the rescuers to stop. They knew what that mine could do. They knew pushing further would only risk more lives. When the bodies were finally recovered, days later, the town of Red Willow Ridge went quiet in a way it never had before. Shops closed. People whispered. The hills around the mine felt heavier somehow, like they were watching. To this day, locals say that if you stand near the old mine entrance late at night, you can hear something strange. A low, rushing sound. Like a breath. Like water moving where it shouldn't. And if you listen long enough, it almost sounds like the mountain is remembering. So if you ever find yourself underground and everything suddenly goes silent, pay attention. Because sometimes, silence is the last warning you get. Back in the early 1980s, there was a cold little town way up north called Raven's Crossing. It wasn't much to look at. Just a handful of houses, a few bars, and a long stretch of frozen road that made you feel like the rest of the world had forgotten you. Most people only knew the place for one thing: gold. Years earlier, someone had found gold buried deep under the rock, and that discovery changed everything. Raven's Crossing went from a sleepy settlement to a booming town almost overnight. People showed up from everywhere, chasing money, chasing work, chasing a better life. And at the center of it all was a massive operation known as Black Hollow Mine. Black Hollow opened in 1961 and ran nonstop for decades. Day and night, men went underground and came back up covered in dust, sweat, and exhaustion. The mine paid well, better than anything else for hundreds of miles, so people put up with the danger. By the time the story really kicks off, almost everyone in town either worked at the mine or depended on someone who did. By 1987, Black Hollow was owned by a hard-nosed businesswoman named Margaret Henslow. She wasn't from Raven's Crossing and never pretended to care about it. To her, the town was just numbers on a page. Profit in, cost out. And when the gold veins started thinning, she decided the workers were the easiest thing to cut. That's when everything went wrong. The miners were told their pay would be reduced. No discussion, no warning. Just a notice posted on a corkboard outside the locker room. Guys who'd spent 20 years risking their lives underground suddenly couldn't afford groceries. The anger hit fast and deep. The union voted to strike. Brothers voted against brothers. Best friends stopped talking. Husbands argued with wives at kitchen tables late into the night. And when the strike officially began, the town changed almost immediately. Management didn't wait long. They found a legal loophole that allowed them to bring in replacement workers from outside the region. People who didn't know the town. People who didn't know the rules. People who didn't care who they were replacing. Those newcomers were escorted through the gates under guard. The strikers screamed at them. Some threw rocks. Others stood there silently, staring, faces red with rage. At night, air horns blared outside the bunkhouses where the replacements slept. Nobody rested. Nobody calmed down. Then the fire started. On the first night, someone torched a storage shed. The flames lit up the sky like a warning signal. A security guard tried to stop it and got beaten badly enough to end up in the hospital. Someone else cut power lines underground, nearly killing anyone still inside. Police showed up in force. Helmets, shields, batons. The miners answered by storming the gates wearing masks and carrying tools that could crack skulls open. Rocks flew. Windows shattered. Warning shots were fired into the air. After that, fear settled into the town like a bad smell. A small group of miners decided yelling wasn't enough anymore. Two cousins, Eli Turner and Marco Turner, started meeting late at night in an old trailer on the edge of town. They called themselves the Iron Dogs, and they believed violence was the only language the company understood. First came sabotage. A small bomb took out the mine's communications tower. Then another explosion destroyed part of the ventilation system. Some miners begged them to stop. Others quietly cheered. Everyone knew it was only a matter of time before someone got hurt. That time came on a gray morning in October of 1989. 9 men were riding a cart deep underground, heading toward a work site that hadn't been touched in weeks. The tunnel was narrow and damp, the walls close enough to scrape your shoulders. Then the lights went out. The explosion was instant. The sound didn't just echo. It slammed back and forth through the tunnel like a living thing. There was no warning, no chance to run, no chance to scream. By the time anyone reached the site, there was nothing left to save. The town lost its mind. Fights broke out in grocery stores. People screamed at each other in the streets. The Iron Dogs were blamed immediately, but they denied it, saying the company's shortcuts had finally killed someone. Investigators didn't buy it. They found bomb fragments, homemade, carefully built. Eventually, suspicion landed on a quiet middle-aged miner named Graham Holt. He wasn't loud. He wasn't a leader. But he knew explosives better than anyone. People said he'd talked about making someone pay. People said he'd bragged after drinking too much. Graham was arrested. During questioning, he walked investigators through the tunnel and explained exactly how the bomb had been placed. He was sentenced to life in prison. Later, he claimed he'd been pressured, threatened, broken down. He appealed. He wrote letters. He begged anyone who would listen. For years, he swore he was innocent. Then, long after most people stopped paying attention, he confessed again. This time quietly. This time without excuses. He said he couldn't stand the idea of his family knowing the truth back then. He said anger had taken over his head. He was released decades later, old and hunched, eyes dull. Some families never forgave him. Others said nothing at all. And Black Hollow Mine? It shut down soon after. The tunnels were sealed. The town dried up. Raven's Crossing became another forgotten place on the map. Now here's the part that still messes with me. Years later, a few friends and I were exploring abandoned places. Not for money, just curiosity. One of those friends was my cousin Liam. A skinny guy who could squeeze through gaps the rest of us couldn't. He loved crawling into places that felt like they were trying to keep secrets. We ended up near an old mine site down in the hills of Briar County. The entrance was half collapsed, the air cold and stale, like something had been breathing in there without lungs. We were about to leave when Liam spotted a side tunnel. He crawled in with his phone. A minute passed. Then we heard him whisper, "Nope, no, absolutely not." He started swearing, his voice shaking. He told us to get ready to leave. When he came back out, his face was pale, eyes wide like he'd seen something that rewired his brain. He refused to show us anything until we were far away. Only when we reached the car did he finally pull up the photos. The first one showed wings, black feathers. Crow wings arranged in a rough circle and glued together. In the center was an eye. Old, cloudy, preserved, watching. The next photos were worse. Small animals stitched together wrong. A rat with fish skin. Frogs with bird heads. Everything dried, preserved, posed. Then came the last image. A doll, made from bones, standing upright. Its skull tilted slightly, like it knew it was being looked at. Its head was crowned with what looked like matted insect bodies. Its body was wrapped in tanned skin, sewn into something like clothes. Liam deleted the photos immediately. He said having them felt dangerous. Like whatever made those things didn't like being seen. I laughed it off back then. I don't laugh anymore. People who do things like that don't stop. They practice. They prepare. And abandoned mines are perfect places to hide work you don't want anyone to find. So if there's one thing I'll swear by, it's this. Don't go into abandoned mines. Not for fun. Not for curiosity. Some places remember what happened in them. And some things are still down there, waiting for someone curious enough to come looking. I've always liked being underground, but probably not for the reasons most people imagine. I'm not some fearless adventurer squeezing through tiny holes for fun. I learned pretty early that tight spaces can turn on you fast. These days, I stick to old, forgotten places where you can still stand up straight and walk around. Places that feel wrong and abandoned, but don't usually try to crush you alive. Still, even the safer places have a way of reminding you that you don't belong there. This happened a few years back, around 2016, when I was living in a small rural town, far from anything exciting. Back then, I spent most of my free time exploring abandoned places. Old factories, empty houses, forgotten tunnels. Anything that felt like time had stopped there. I wasn't alone either. I usually explored with my best friend at the time, a woman named Lila. We weren't dating, not exactly. We were just close. The kind of close you get when you trust someone enough to walk into dark places with them. One weekend, we decided to check out an abandoned zinc mine hidden deep in the hills outside our town. Locals called the area Devil's Backbone, mostly because the land twisted and folded in sharp, uneven ridges. The mine itself hadn't been used in decades. Nature had tried to swallow it, but the entrance was still there, like a black mouth half buried in dirt and vines. We didn't go in through the main entrance. That would have been too easy. Instead, we found a lower opening farther down the slope, half hidden by brush. It was colder there. The air felt heavier, like it didn't want to move. When we stepped inside, the daylight faded fast, replaced by the dull beam of our headlamps cutting through dust and darkness. At first, it felt quiet in a peaceful way. Just the sound of our boots crunching over gravel and old debris. Water dripped somewhere far off, slow and steady, like a ticking clock. The walls were damp and stained with strange mineral streaks that looked like something had melted and frozen mid-drip. We walked deeper, following a wide tunnel that sloped gently downward. After maybe 10 minutes, we reached what looked like a long ledge running along the wall. I assumed it was solid rock, part of an old mining level. I stepped onto it without thinking, moving ahead while Lila stayed a few steps back. That's when the ground shifted. Not a loud crack, not a dramatic collapse. Just a soft, ugly flex beneath my boots, like stepping on a rotten porch board. I froze instantly. My stomach dropped so hard it felt like it tried to crawl out through my throat. I looked down. The ledge was covered in thick mud, packed there over decades. But underneath that mud, I could see faint lines. Old planks, wood. My heart started hammering. This wasn't rock. This was a fake floor. Someone, a very long time ago, had laid wooden boards over a drop and covered them with dirt. And I had just walked right onto it. The worst part was not knowing what was underneath me. I couldn't tell how deep it went. 4 feet? 10? 40? My light didn't reach the bottom. It just vanished into blackness. The kind of black that feels like it's staring back at you. I didn't move. I barely breathed. Every tiny shift of my weight made the wood groan softly, a slow, tired sound, like it was warning me not to push my luck. I whispered Lila's name, my voice shaking. She asked what was wrong, and I told her very slowly not to move and not to come any closer. Backing up was the hardest thing I've ever done. I slid my feet backward inch by inch, spreading my weight as carefully as I could. The boards creaked again, and I imagined them snapping. Imagined the sudden drop, the sound of splintering wood, the fall, the impact. For a few seconds, my mind filled with awful images. Bones breaking, lights going out, being trapped down there, alone, where no one would find me for years. When my heel finally touched solid rock again, I almost laughed, or cried, or both. My legs were shaking so badly, I had to lean against the wall to keep from collapsing. It felt like my body didn't realize yet that I was safe. We didn't explore any farther. We backed away slowly, then faster, until the tunnel widened and the air felt a little less thick. When we stepped back into daylight, my whole body felt wrong, like I'd just woken up from a nightmare that was still clinging to me. I could barely explain what happened. Layla just listened, her face pale, and then she hugged me without saying a word. She understood. You don't need words for that kind of fear. That should have been enough to scare me away from underground places forever. But it wasn't my first close call. Years earlier, back in 2010, I was exploring an old silver mine on the other side of the state with a coworker named Ben. He wasn't a close friend, more like someone who liked danger a little too much. The mine was rougher than the one with Lila. Smaller tunnels, sharper drops. The kind of place that felt tight, even when you weren't moving. At one point, we came to a narrow crack in the rock. It was just wide enough to turn sideways and squeeze through. I remember joking about it, trying to keep things light. Ben went first. I followed. Inside, the rock pressed in from all sides. If you looked at it from above, the tunnel pinched in and out like stacked hourglasses. Wide near my shoulders, tight at my chest, wider at my hips, then narrow again near my legs. About 20 feet in, the floor disappeared. Suddenly, there was nothing under my feet. I had to brace my boots against the walls to keep myself from sliding down. I couldn't see the bottom. My light just vanished into darkness again. That same deep, endless dark. My arms started to burn as I tried to hold myself in place. I couldn't get enough leverage to pull up, and my boots kept slipping. Then one foot lost its grip, then the other. I dropped a few inches and got stuck hard. My chest and ribs wedged into the narrowest part of the tunnel. My arms were bent awkwardly, useless. Every breath scraped against stone. I tried to inhale deeply and couldn't. The rock pressed in so tightly that my chest barely moved. Each breath felt smaller than the last. Panic hit me like a wave. I kicked, thrashed, did everything wrong. The more I moved, the deeper I slid. My vision started to blur. I remember thinking very clearly that this was how people died without anyone knowing. Not screaming, not dramatic. Just stuck. Quiet. Forgotten. Somehow, through the fear, I forced myself to stop moving. I planted one foot against each wall and pushed as hard as I could. My legs screamed, but it worked. Just enough. I gained an inch. Then another. Slowly, painfully, I worked my way forward until the tunnel widened and I could finally stand. When I got out, I threw up from the adrenaline. I didn't go underground again for a long time after that. Now, when I think back on both of those moments, what scares me most isn't the danger itself. It's how quiet it was. No monsters. No warnings. Just old wood, tight stone, and the slow realization that the earth doesn't care if you're there or not. Every time I walk past an abandoned tunnel or a dark opening in the ground, I feel that same chill. That same feeling that something down there is waiting, not to chase you, not to grab you, just to let you make one small mistake. People in the town of Willow Creek still talk about what happened that summer, even though most of them lower their voices when they do. It was June of 2004, one of those nights where the air feels heavy and still, like the world is holding its breath. Nothing seemed unusual from the outside. Just a small house at the edge of a quiet street, porch light glowing softly, windows dark. Inside, though, something terrible was already unfolding. 62-year-old Margaret Halley had fallen asleep on the couch in the living room. She did that a lot. The television murmured to itself, filling the room with low voices and flickering shadows. Her grandnephew, 5-year-old Oliver Reed, was asleep down the hallway in a small bedroom decorated with glow-in-the-dark stars. Sometime after 3 a.m, a sound broke the silence. A soft creak, maybe a door, maybe a floorboard. Margaret never had the chance to wake up properly. The person came out of the darkness and attacked her where she lay. There was no warning, no struggle anyone could hear outside the house. Just sudden violence in a room that had been peaceful seconds earlier. The attack didn't stop until Margaret was gone. Down the hallway, Oliver stirred. At first, he thought he was dreaming. Then he heard something else. A thump, a strange scraping noise. His eyes opened and he listened. The house didn't feel right anymore. The air felt wrong. Oliver slid out of bed and padded toward the kitchen, rubbing his eyes. That's when he saw him. A man standing there, half lit by the moon through the window. Too tall, too still. Oliver froze. Later, when he tried to explain it, he said the man didn't turn right away. Just stood there, like he already knew the boy was watching. Fear hit Oliver all at once. He ran back to his room, slammed the door, and dove under his blanket. He pulled it over his head and squeezed his eyes shut, pretending to be asleep, hoping with everything he had that the man would go away. He didn't. The door opened. The floor creaked again, slow and careful this time. Oliver felt the mattress dip as someone came closer. Then pain, a sudden sharp blow to his face. Everything went black. When Oliver survived, people called it a miracle. He had bruises all over his small body. There was a thin cut across his neck, shallow but terrifying. Doctors believed the attacker had meant to kill him too, and stopped at the last possible second. Why, no one could say. The mind has strange ways of protecting itself. When Oliver woke up hours later, the sun was already high. Birds were chirping outside, cheerful and cruel. He didn't remember the attack. Not really. Just a sense that something awful had happened. He walked into the living room and found Margaret's body still on the couch. She looked wrong, still, gray. Oliver stood there for a long time, staring, waiting for her to move. She didn't. Not knowing what else to do, Oliver picked up the phone. His hands shook so badly, he almost dropped it. He called the nearest house and left a message on their machine. His small voice cracked as he apologized and said his auntie was dead. He said someone had hurt her. He said he was alone. Then he walked next door. The neighbor, Denise Carter, opened the door and stared at the bruised, blood-speckled child on her porch. Instead of pulling him inside, instead of calling for help right away, she told him to wait. She said she had things to finish. Breakfast, dishes. She made him sit on the porch for nearly an hour while he stared at the street and tried not to cry. When Denise finally went to the house, she saw what had happened and screamed. The police arrived quickly after that. Flashing lights filled the quiet street. Inside, officers asked Oliver gentle questions. When they asked if he knew who had hurt Margaret, the boy hesitated. Then he said a name. He said the man looked like Uncle Ray. Ray Holloway was Margaret's former foster son, someone the family barely spoke to anymore. Oliver repeated the claim again and again. He said the man sounded like Ray too. The officers latched onto that. It gave them something solid in a case that felt like a nightmare. Years later, Oliver would say he wasn't sure. He would say he was scared and didn't want to make anyone angry. But by then, it was too late. Ray was arrested, charged, put on trial. The prosecutors told a simple story. They said Ray was angry. They said Margaret had tried to control his life, tried to fix him, tried to interfere. They pointed to Oliver's words over and over. Looked like him, sounded like him. The jury listened. They ignored a lot of things. They ignored the lack of physical evidence. They ignored the hair found at the scene that didn't match Ray. They ignored the fact that Ray had been at a bar across town until nearly 3 a.m, surrounded by people who backed up his story. The timeline didn't work, but emotion filled the gaps logic should have occupied. Ray Holloway was convicted in 2005 and sentenced to life in prison. For Ray and his wife, Lena, the world ended that day. Lena knew her husband didn't do it. Knowing, though, didn't matter much when the prison doors closed. They refused to give up. With the help of a private investigator named Cole Winters, they began digging. Slowly, painfully, they found cracks in the story. 3 years after the trial, Oliver gave a new statement. He said the man who hurt him had dark brown eyes. Ray's eyes were pale gray. The court didn't care. Appeals were denied. Judges said memories change. Judges said families influence children. The system shut its doors. Lena decided she would open them herself. She went back to the beginning. She talked to Oliver again. That's when he mentioned something strange. He talked about waiting on Denise Carter's porch, about how long it took, about how scared he was. That didn't sit right. Lena looked into Denise's life and found something she wasn't supposed to find. Denise had a long-term boyfriend named Victor Cross. He was violent. He had been in and out of prison most of his life. And he had been released just 2 days before Margaret was killed. Victor was locked up again now, serving time at the same prison as Ray. Lena did something desperate. She asked her husband to help her prove the truth from inside prison walls. Ray watched Victor closely. He noticed the cigarettes. Every day, same routine. One afternoon, Ray waited until Victor dropped a cigarette butt and walked away. Ray bent down, pretending to tie his shoe, and picked it up. That tiny, filthy object changed everything. The DNA matched the hair from the crime scene. Victor Cross was arrested. When questioned, Denise finally broke. She admitted Victor had been in her house that morning. She admitted she was scared. She admitted she chose silence. Ray was released in December 2011. Victor would die in prison years later. Ray and Lena didn't stay married. Too much damage. Too many scars. But they stayed connected, bound by the truth they fought for. And Willow Creek never quite felt safe again. People still lock their doors a little earlier. They still glance at shadows in quiet rooms. Because everyone knows now how thin the line is between an ordinary night and something unspeakable waiting in the dark. Lena Mae Holloway was born on September 3rd, 1972, in a rough, noisy city called Brighthaven. It wasn't a place people dreamed of growing up in, but Lena loved it anyway. Even as a little kid, she was always humming. She sang while brushing her teeth, while tying her shoes, while walking to school. Music followed her everywhere. At first, she loved old soul records, a kind her aunt played on a scratched-up turntable late at night. Slow songs, sad songs, songs that felt like they were telling secrets. But as Lena got older, something changed. The music she loved started getting louder, faster, angrier. By the time she was in her late teens, she was completely hooked on raw, noisy punk music that felt like shouting into the dark. When she was 19, Lena moved away to attend a small arts college in a quiet town called Red Willow. That's where everything really began. She met 3 other students who felt just as restless and wired as she did. They weren't close friends at first, more like people who recognized something familiar in each other. Together, they started a band and called it Static Mercy. They practiced in basements and garages that smelled like dust and old paint. Their music wasn't clean or polished, but it was honest. Loud drums, buzzing guitars, Lena's voice cutting straight through it all. People noticed. Word spread. Soon, their shows were packed with sweaty bodies and ringing ears. After a few years, they made a risky choice. They dropped out, packed up everything they owned, and moved to a bigger city called North Shore. It was known for its gritty music scene and endless rain. The streets always looked slick, like they'd never fully dried. Musicians there didn't smile much, but they listened closely. Lena stood out immediately. People said she had a way of pulling everyone into the same room emotionally, even if they'd never met before. She talked to strangers like they were old friends. For a while, it felt like Static Mercy was right on the edge of something huge. And then came the night that ended everything. One humid evening in early summer, Lena went out alone to a small bar called the Rusted Nail. It was dim and sticky inside, with flickering lights and warped wooden floors. She laughed too loud. She drank too much. By the time she left, her head felt fuzzy, and the streetlights looked like glowing halos. Her apartment was close, just a few blocks away. She lived in a cramped basement unit beneath an old brick building that always smelled faintly of mold. On her way home, she stopped upstairs to check on her older cousin, who lived in the same building. They talked for a few minutes. Lena joked about rehearsal. She promised she'd call in the morning. That was the last time anyone saw her alive. Early the next morning, someone walking their dog found her body near an empty intersection on the edge of town. Her clothes were torn. Her face was bruised. Marks on her neck told a story no one wanted to imagine. She had been hurt badly, intentionally, violently. No one knew who she was at first. She didn't have her wallet, no phone, just her body lying there, cooling in the morning air. It took hours before someone finally recognized her. The news hit the city like a punch to the chest. Musicians stopped feeling safe. Doors were locked. Shows were canceled. People who had once felt untouchable suddenly realized how thin that feeling really was. Years passed. Leads dried up. Hope faded. But one woman, a private investigator named Mara Quinn, refused to let the case disappear. Even after the money ran out, she kept going. She reread reports. She pushed for evidence to be saved. She waited for science to catch up. It took more than a decade, but eventually it did. A man named Daniel Cross was arrested after his DNA matched evidence taken from Lena's body. He'd never known her. He didn't need to. According to investigators, she'd just been in the wrong place at the wrong time. He was convicted and sent away for decades. Lena was buried in a quiet cemetery far from where she died. People still visit her grave. They leave flowers, guitar picks, handwritten notes. Some say the city never fully recovered. The clock made of bones now This next part, this is where things get really strange. I've worked a lot of odd jobs as a private investigator. Cheating spouses, missing pets, people who swear they're being watched. But nothing prepared me for the call about the clock. The client said it had been in their family for generations, passed down like a treasure. No one knew where it came from, only that it was old and important. They wanted answers. When I saw it, I felt uneasy right away. The clock sat on the table, quiet and still, about the size of a small microwave. Its surface was pale, almost too pale, like it had never known sunlight. The carvings were incredibly detailed, tiny shapes and patterns that made my eyes hurt if I stared too long. The face of the clock shimmered faintly, smooth, white, too smooth. I took it to a lab run by a guy I trusted. He scraped off a sample and promised to call in a week. He called 2 days later. His voice was shaky. "It's not wood," he said. "It's bone, human bone. Not just a piece here or there. Almost the entire clock. Teeth carved into decorative patterns. Hair woven into tiny joints. Fingernails ground down and shaped into thin supports. Whoever made it knew exactly what they were doing." I called the police. The client was horrified, but cooperative. They hadn't known. Or so they said. More tests followed. No DNA matches. No missing persons. The lab estimated the remains were hundreds of years old. In the end, the authorities decided not to press charges. The client was given a choice: keep the clock or lay the remains to rest. They chose cremation. The clock was destroyed. The ashes were buried under the name John Doe. Case closed, mostly. But here's the thing that still bothers me. Clocks are meant to make noise, ticking, chiming, marking time. And sometimes, late at night, when everything is quiet, I still think about that clock, about the sounds it must have made when it worked. And I can't help wondering if those sounds ever really stopped. Because some things don't like being turned into objects, and some screams don't fade. They just wait.